John McNee's readings contain adult themes and violence. They are not intended for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Keeping Mum by David Watkins. Mum went downhill rapidly after they burnt her mother. It was like she gave up, as if she'd been holding on just to outlive Gran. Dad said Mum had cancer, but I didn't know what that meant. She hadn't got out of bed since my birthday, and that had been nearly 6 weeks ago now. I would visit for hours, when school and my chores were done for the day. Usually to sit in silence, but sometimes, and these were the best times, to be rewarded with a thin-lipped smile and a few words. "You'll be going to the big school soon," she said. It was 4 months till then, but I didn't tell her. She fell asleep anyway, like the effort of speaking had taken all her energy reserves. School wasn't the same as when she'd been my age. Back then, there were millions of people and thousands of schools. Being the only one my age, I would be on my own when I crossed the yard to go to the other shed that meant big school. The next day she spoke again. "They'll tell you everything then, and you'll know it all." It was like she hadn't realized a day had passed, and I tried not to laugh at her. She didn't know what she was saying. We carried on like this for a week, her saying a sentence before passing out again. I would stay with her, mop her brow and hold her hand. There was, after all, nothing else to do, no one and nothing to play with. No one in big school ever played with me, or anyone still in little school. The other 3 kids in my school were all younger than me, and treated me like I had the plague. Dad came in, looked at Mum, and grimaced. Before, he was always laughing. Dust caked the lines of his face, aging him. One of the burners was with him, reeking of petrol. "Hi, Dad." "John?" I nodded at the bigger man, the way I'd seen Dad do. Something about him had always made me feel nervous, but then that was the point of the burners. They weren't supposed to be your mates. "Just coming to see how your mum is doing," John said, without a smile. I wasn't sure I'd ever seen him smile. "Tommy, why don't you go get some sun?" "Don't want to." Dad and John exchanged a look. Dad was the only one who still called me Tommy. "Go on, son, outside." "No." "I'm not asking, Tommy." Dad had never raised his voice, didn't have to, and I wasn't going to let him start now. Not in front of John. I kissed Mum's head, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from the burner. Her eyes flickered, but didn't open. I went out into the non-existent sun to play with non-existent friends. The following morning, I woke before Dad and went to Mum's room in the basement. It was early, so I crept through the house. Daylight had not yet fully arrived. Everything was still shrouded in shadow, giving the house an otherworldly feel. I ignored the gun on the table by the door, just like I was always told to. If I touched it, I would get a hiding, sick Mum or not. I opened the door to the cellar, wincing as it creaked on its ancient hinges. The stairs, too, groaned under my step, but I figured I was far enough from Dad's room that he wouldn't hear me. At the bottom of the stairs was a short corridor with 2 doors leading from it. One was to the toilet, and the other to our old dumping room, which, since she'd fallen sick, was now Mum's bedroom. There was not much in the room. A table with a lamp that took forever to bring enough light to the room, and a bed. Mum's dark shape was huddled in the bed now, not moving. That wasn't unusual, so I crossed through the darkness to the lamp. I had no trouble finding my way. I had done this too many times to count. Patience eluded me as I lit the lamp, waiting for its pathetic glow to illuminate the small room. As the light grew, I started to smile at the thought of seeing Mum again. In my mind, she was as she was before the cancer and everything else. Quick to smile, patient, kind, loving. A tear started to form in the corner of my eye as I looked at her, and I brushed it away before it could swell enough to roll down my cheek. She was strapped to the bed. 2 thick ropes tied her wrists to the posts of the bed, and a further, larger one secured both legs to the frame. "Mum!" I shouted, waking her. She tried to sit up, but couldn't move. Her eyes were wide as she saw me. A gag was forced into her mouth, dampening any sound she might make. I looked frantically for a way to untie the ropes. She shook her head, making muffled noises. I hugged her and tried to remove the gag. It was jammed in tightly, so it took me a few tugs to loosen it enough to pull it down. It sat around her neck, a spittle-soaked scarf. "Who did this to you?" She couldn't answer as she sucked in air and sobs racked her body. "It's not what you think, Tommy." I turned at his voice, sudden rage flooding through me. "Dad! Why?" "Shush now, Tommy." His eyes were on Mum, and I was shocked to see a tear there. "Go on outside. Go play." "Not until you untie her." "I can't do that." He looked like he was going to say more, but he shook his head instead. "I can't." "Dad, untie her now, you—" "Don't say it, Tom," Mum said. "Your dad is doing his best." Before I could say anything else, John arrived, bringing that familiar stench all the burners had. His dirty overalls strained to contain his hulking frame. What was he doing here? John had a key for everyone's places. All the burners did. He was carrying pliers in one hand and a gun in the other. Not the gun, Dad's, but shiny, black, and deadly all the same. Mum let out another wretched sob when she saw him. "Morning, little man," John said. "Still using those big words and being all clever." His smile stopped so far from his eyes that he needn't have bothered. Maybe that was why I'd never seen him smile before. He was no good at it. "Steve, Meg, you decided?" Another sob from Mum. Dad was shaking. What the hell was going on? "Pliers or gun, Steve? You know—" "Jesus, John, not in front of Tommy." "Clock's ticking." "She might have months left." "She might not." Dad looked at Mum, more than one tear in his eye now. A lot more. She just shook her head, her own tears spilling onto the pillow. "Time to go, Tommy." He didn't look at me, but I went to the door anyway. I slammed it behind me, but it bounced out of its lock. As I reached halfway up the stairs, I heard Dad say, "Gun." Running back down, I stumbled at the bottom, tripped over my own feet, and landed heavily on the ground. Neither Dad nor John seemed to notice, their attention fully on Mum, so I stayed put, looking at them from the floor of the open doorway. I didn't understand what I was seeing. Dad was holding the gun to Mum's head. His hand was trembling, and she was shaking her head. They stood like that for a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. I tried to get up, tried to move, but couldn't. Dad stepped back and threw the gun onto the bedside table. He roared with frustration. "Would you like me to do it?" John said, grinning. "No, I can't. I just can't." "Then you know what I have to do." Dad nodded. He stroked Mum's hair with a still trembling hand. "I can't lose you. I love you," she said, shocking me with the clarity of her voice. Mum seemed to understand and be accepting what was going on. I felt my legs begin to shake with a combination of anger and frustration. "Sorry, Meg," John said. He raised the pliers and took a step towards the bed. Dad caught his arm. They were so intent on each other that they didn't see me crawl into the corner of the room. "If I see you enjoy this—" "What, Steve? What'll you do?" John sneered, towering over him. Dad let him go and pushed past, head down. He stopped in the doorway and leant wearily on the frame. "Get it over with." "I'm so sorry," he whispered, and I heard his footsteps on the stairs. That noise faded and was replaced by another, far more disturbing sound. Mum was gagging. I stood on shaky legs. John had the pliers in her mouth and was pulling hard. She was shaking with pain as he pulled. With a grunt, he wrenched the bloody pliers out, a white tooth in their grip. He raised it to her face and grinned at her. "Only another 30 or so to go, Meg. It'll soon be over," he said, chuckling. His eyes shone with a light I had never seen before. He threw the tooth away and returned to Mum. She was squealing, trying to turn her head away. John grabbed her head with his other hand. "I like it when you struggle. Makes me hard. Remember that." He jammed the pliers back in her mouth, and she gagged again. I could hear her muted screams, hear the sucking sound as another tooth came free, hear his effort. A tooth landed on the floor, bouncing several times on the concrete. Mum cried out as he removed it, but he went straight back to work, and I heard her choking on the pliers. "Stop it!" I yelled, slapping John on the back. "You lost, kid. This has to be done." He grinned. "It's the only way." I continued to pound on his back, but he was too big for any of the hits to do more than irritate him. Finally, he pushed me away, shoving me into the corner of the room. My eyes fell on the gun, lying on the table. John was already ignoring me, already working another tooth loose. Touching the gun was taboo, the only thing guaranteed to annoy Dad. But this wasn't the same weapon. I ran, picked up the gun, pressed it to John's side and pulled the trigger before I had chance to think. The bang echoed around the room, its loudness shocking me. John crumpled to the floor, blood pouring out of the hole in his side. He dropped the pliers, complete with a bloody tooth in them, as he fell. His hands clamped around the hole in his side, but it was too large, and blood spilled out around his fingers. His lips were moving, but all I could hear was a loud, painful ringing, and I shook my head to clear it. Mum was sobbing, blood streaming out of her mouth. She was shaking her head, shouting, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. A hand on my shoulder made me jump and turn at the same time. I think I screamed, but I wasn't sure of anything. Dad pulled me to him, lifting the gun slowly out of my hands. He held it with clear distaste, but then started lifting my shirt, looking all over my body. I could hear muffled words now. It sounded like, "Bite." "Can you hear me, Tommy?" His voice, suddenly clear above the ringing. I nodded. He was looking right at me, but his eyes kept flicking to look at something over my shoulder. I was confused. The only thing behind me was John, and he was dead. "Go upstairs and leave the house. Shout 'They're back' as loud as you can. Really loud, and keep shouting over and over. Then I want you to shoot anything coming out the front door that isn't me, okay?" I nodded again, but now there was another noise underneath his voice. It sounded like chewing. I turned to look at Mum, and Dad grabbed my head with both hands, keeping me focused on his face. "No, son, don't," he whispered. Just go." It was too late. Out of the corner of my eye, I had seen something that did not make sense, and I turned to look. John was standing, blood still pouring out of his side as he leaned over the bed. He was extremely pale, but wasn't trying to hold the blood in anymore. He opened his mouth wide, pressed his teeth to Mum's neck, and ripped a chunk of flesh out. Blood covered her neck like a crimson tattoo, and he ripped another huge piece of flesh free from her body, causing more blood to squirt across the room. Mum was not moving. "Mum!" John's head whipped around. His eyes had changed, no longer shining with sadistic light, bloodshot to the point that no white remained. His mouth was red, and the blood and gristle had dripped down his front. As he turned to face us, he licked his lips with a long tongue, grinning through the gore. "Run!" Dad yelled. He pushed me through the door, then turned back to face John. "Run, Tom!" I fled. I heard Dad pull the trigger and winced at the bang that followed. A loud crash rang out, and the door rattled in its ancient hinges, one of them popping free. Then I was upstairs, running for our front door. I yanked it open, and sunlight nearly blinded me as I crashed into the street beyond. 2 steps later, I remembered the gun and sprinted back into the house. I pulled it off the table and ran back outside, slipping on our porch, which was slick with dew. I slid along the tarmac of the street, taking the skin off my arms. The gun slid out of my hand, its reassuring weight gone in a second. I scrabbled for it, but my fingers brushed the grip. Crawling a few feet more, I scooped it up and turned to face the house. My back was drenched with sweat, and my hand was shaking as I aimed the gun. "They're back!" I screamed. I had no idea what that meant, but I screamed it again and again. Our front door was still open, but it was dark inside. I saw a shape moving in the shadows, limping towards the light. I screamed the words again and again until my mouth was dry and the figure emerged into the sunshine. It was Dad. Relief washed through me, and I smiled at him. Another figure shuffled into view, and I saw John. Half of his jaw was missing, as well as his left ear. I wrenched my gaze from John's ruined face and stared at Dad. Blood was pulsing out of a hole in his neck, and it covered his chest. The hole was ragged, torn shreds of skin flapping around the wound. His eyes shone red as he blinked in the sunlight. "Dad?" He started to run towards me, terrifying quickly, with John close behind. I raised the gun and pulled the trigger. It clicked empty.